Coming up on the Nick Craig Show, environmental activism, how left-wing groups force their climate agenda and the real impact it has on your daily life. And a good Wednesday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Don't forget that you can take the show on demand on your own time by checking out the Nick Craig Show in your favorite podcast app. You can also listen online by visiting the website nickcraig.com. Our show this morning is brought to you by Melissa Gott and the Law Group here in Wilmington. For any legal challenges you might be dealing with across southeastern North Carolina, give them a call, 910-251-6088. Or visit their website, lawgroupnc.com. So, environmental activism. This is an interesting thread and an interesting topic, and there's a couple of different things to break down with this. I caught a very interesting report that was published just before Christmas over by a group called Power the Future, and the headline and the name of their report is called The Art of the Delay: How Environmental Activism Raises Prices on Everyday Goods. And so let's take a couple of steps back and just kind of lay out some of the things that we have seen over the last couple of decades, specifically as it relates to an activism when it comes to environmental issues. And of course, the first thing that comes to your mind is climate change, right? This has been the big push. This is the big narrative on the left as it relates to energy discussions here in the United States. The most important thing to those on the political left is climate change. It's not reliable energy. It's not affordable energy. It's not stability as it relates to energy. It's about the impact that said decisions could possibly have on the climate. Now, there's very little data, very little evidence, if any at all, to back up the claim that if we just completely shoot the United States into a position where the only thing we talk about is wind and solar, that will somehow save, and I throw that in air quotes, the earth, right? Because that's what this is all about. You've heard some of the ridiculous comments and claims before from those on the left that the earth is dying, the earth is collapsing, the earth is lighting itself on fire. And if we don't make very significant changes, because that's what we're talking about here, and if we don't make very significant changes to the way in which we live our lives, the earth in which we know it, the not only the United States, but the entire globe as we know it, will cease to exist. There's a great clip from Katie Porter, who is a ridiculous left-winger out of California, from a couple of years ago. This was posted back in 2021. It's one of my favorite clips of Katie Porter. She is now running to be the governor in California. She's an out-of-control left-winger. Back in 2021, she was on a town hall-style Zoom internet meeting with everybody's favorite environmental activist, Greta Thunberg, or Greta Doomberg, as I like to call her, the young lady from, I don't know, somewhere over in Europe is, I guess, where she's from, Germany or something like that runs around the world, most of the time flying via some sort of private airline to talk about how the earth is collapsing, the earth is dying. You'll remember her clips, shame on you. She was speaking to like the UN or the British Parliament or somebody. Shame on you. You're destroying our future. You're destroying our lives. Shame on you. Shame on you. So this is a clip back from 2021 with Katie Porter, and she's talking about her daughter, who at the time was only 9 years old, an abject child, right? 9 years old. And this was Katie Porter back in 2021. This is why environmental activism is so dangerous. Take a listen to this.
I have a 9-year-old daughter. I have 3 kids. And I told my 9-year-old daughter that I was going to be speaking with you. And I said, what do you think about the climate change? And she said, the earth is on fire and we're all going to die soon.
So that's Katie Porter, her 9-year-old daughter. Hey, daughter, I'm going to speak to Greta Thunberg. What are your thoughts? The earth is on fire and we're all going to die. Now, not only is that, of course, a completely ridiculous thought for a 9-year-old to have, part of the reason why so many of the folks in the younger generation that are so progressive have the mindset that they do is because this is genuinely what they believe. They are of the mindset, and this is just one example, there's plenty of others, that the earth is on fire and they're all going to die. We're all going to die soon. Soon is I would argue that's a pretty relative term. If I said, hey, soon coming up on the show, we're going to be talking to X guest, you would assume that would be coming up in the next couple of days, right? Maybe in the next week or two. Soon. That's a relative term that I think most people understand. Soon, we will be heading towards the primary elections here in North Carolina. Yeah, that makes sense. They're coming up in mid-February. That's relatively soon. If you make the argument that we're all going to die soon because the earth is on fire, I would suspect that that is coming in a relatively short amount of time. So many of these individuals, especially the younger progressive folk, the reason they're so miserable is because this is what they believe. This is genuinely what they think. That if you continue to drive around your awful, terrible gas-powered vehicle, you are going to cause the earth to explode. It's on fire, according to Katie Porter's 9-year-old daughter. We're all going to die. What a miserable way to go about life. I'm not trying to make a joke out of it. It's miserable for these people. It's sad. Imagine your political ideology putting you in a position where you wake up every single day and you are of the mindset, you are of the opinion that nothing really matters. Getting an education is irrelevant, working hard at your job, fostering relationships with a romantic partner and friends and coworkers, all of that stuff is kind of irrelevant. And it makes sense that why it would be, because we're all going to die. The earth is going to simultaneously explode due to CO2 emissions and climate change. And if you are of that mindset, then I understand why you're so miserable in your life, why you have no friends, why your only interaction with individuals is on social media, doom posting about how everything is so awful and terrible. It's a miserable mindset to have. But this is what is fostered on the left. This is genuinely how people feel. And when you talk about, in this example, Katie Porter's daughter, the Democrat representative from California, this is indoctrination at its finest. Now, I can't expressly determine where and why Katie Porter's daughter believes that the world is going to end and we're all going to die. Her mother's an out-of-control, radical, crazy progressive. You'll remember over just the last probably 5 or 6 months, some pretty brutal videos of Katie Porter had leaked on social media of her just being a jerk to her staff, yelling at people that work with her over Zoom meetings not being set up correctly. It just seems like a really nasty, awful person. Her political ideology is just as bad. She now wants to be the governor of California, which she might be perfect out there because of all the nonsense that you see out in the out on the left coast there in California. So I can't speak to why Katie Porter's daughter believes this, whether it's education or her insane mother, but it's indoctrination. 9-year-old children. I think I'm going to make a statement that mostly everybody would agree with. 9-year-old children should not be worried about climate change. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing for children to have interests and be involved in things. That's not what I'm getting at all. But I will contend to you that having a 9-year-old be petrified about their future. When you're 9 years old, you're presumably going to live, what, an average of like maybe 60 more. I don't know what the average life expectancy is. It's what, got to be the early 70s or something like that. So you're going to live at least 60 more years, presumably, as somebody who's 9 years old. You literally have your entire life ahead of you. And one of your fears, one of your concerns is that the earth is on fire and everybody is going to die. I would argue that's not healthy. I would argue that that is not a good mindset for somebody that is that young to have. But many of the radical progressives in places that you see, like New York City, where they just elected Zohran Mamdani, he was recently sworn in as mayor back on the January the 1st. That is the mindset of a lot of these individuals. And it kind of adds all of that. You add all of this stuff up, and then you start to understand, at least in some way, shape, or form, why these individuals have the mindset that they do. Why so many of these individuals are so radical in the things that they believe. They think their time is short. They think the earth is just moments away. Soon, it is going to be on fire. Exactly what that means, I don't know, but that is what they think. That is what they believe. So turning over to this report over by Power the Future, The Art of the Delay, How Environmental Activism Raises Prices on Everyday Goods. This is a report out from this group, and it goes through the delay ecosystem that many individuals and many groups on the left play out and roll out to push forth their climate change agenda, push forward their environmental activism. And this report really lays out the entire picture of it. So just reading a little bit from this report, it says, over the past decade, environmental advocacy has evolved into a sophisticated, well-funded ecosystem that influences infrastructure outcomes at nearly every stage of the development process. Rather than opposing projects solely through public protest, and this is important, modern climate activism increasingly operates through institutional mechanicalism, litigation, regulatory pressure, academic research, elections, as well as the permitting process that shape how, when, and whether projects are allowed to move forward. Major donors and philanthropist foundations often sit at the center of this ecosystem, providing financial support that flows outward to a network of aligned organizations and activities. These efforts are not limited to a single tactic or venue. Instead, they reinforce one another across multiple institutions that collectively govern infrastructure development. One of, I think, the greatest accomplishments thus far of the Trump 2.0, the second administration, was the destruction of USAID. This was a conversation in the middle and early parts of 2025. Trump and Elon Musk, Doge, they hacked and slashed USAID. That was one of the major entities that allowed this cycle that is explained in this report to play out. And you've got it through all of these different networks. It's not just one thing. It creates essentially what you can describe as a feedback loop. You get these institutions of higher education on board. You get these professors and all of these individuals on board. They train or indoctrinate the next generation to believe this stuff. You get your friendly advocacy groups out there. They always have the same names. It's very obvious to tell when a left-wing activist group is operating because they'll always have some name, like democracy is always in the name of said group. And it creates this feedback loop that is very hard to break out of. It creates this loop where it appears to the naked eye that you've got a lot of, I don't know what you'd call it, maybe organic operations going on. But it's not organic. It's all a very coordinated attempt to create this strong feedback loop to cause this environmental activism to continue. And so the report lays out a couple of different things in which this network of groups follow. And of course, you would expect the individual donors. You've got the George Soros types, the Rockefeller Foundations, and others that make this possible. So the report highlights things like litigation that challenges permits after they are issued, frequently forcing agencies back into multi-year supplemental reviews or reopening settled questions. For example, let's assume that you have a regulatory agency in a state that approves a nuclear or natural gas power plant. You get litigation from these left-wing groups funded by previously USAID and entities like that sue. And they create years, maybe even decades worth of litigation. Regulatory pressure. particularly through expansive interpretations of environmental review statutes, which raise the procedural bar for approvals and increase the risk of legal vulnerability. Another system that they use, state attorney general actions that introduce additional layers of legal uncertainty even for projects that have already cleared federal review. This is one of the worst. Academic and research institutions that develop studies, frameworks, and policy guidance that agencies are encouraged or pressured to adopt as new baselines. That's really where I think a lot of the rubber meets the road on this. It's in academia and it's in research. You've got very far left progressive environmental groups that kind of behind the scenes, now you can trace it, but it's not publicly and immediately available, that fund these studies, these research reports, these NGOs, these think tank organizations that create these doomsday reports. And yes, they bully state agencies, federal agencies, and others into adopting said bogus science as gospel. They take these very hairy reports at best and turn them into the new North Star, the new gold standard as it relates to environmental research. That's a huge problem. A couple of the other examples listed in the report: judicial education and engagement programs that shape how environmental claims are framed and evaluated within the legal system. And finally, conferences and global climate events that coordinate messaging, strategy, and narratives across judges, advocacy groups, regulators, and policymakers. And you see those throughout the year. You've got multiple climate summits. The big one in Davos every year, in which you literally have hundreds of private jets flying into Davos each and every year for people to claim to you and me that driving our car is bad for the environment. Meanwhile, they will burn hundreds of gallons of jet fuel getting to a so-called climate summit as they preach that your car that you've had for 5 or 6 years is the reason why the earth is getting warmer, the reason why there's more CO2 emissions. Back to the report, The Art of the Delay, it reads, recent reporting has highlighted how some of these systems operate in practice. For example, investigative coverage has shown that judges have participated in environmental law trainings and seminars underwritten or organized by advocacy-aligned nonprofits, raising questions about how legal frameworks and priorities are presented in educational settings. Other reporting has documented how philanthropic entities, including those associated with Michael Bloomberg, have funded staff positions enabled within state attorney general's offices to support climate-related litigation and environmental initiatives. It reads, individually, these activities are often described as education, resource, or capacity building. However, collectively, they function as a feedback loop. Advocacy-driven research informs regulatory expectations. Regulatory standards create new litigation opportunities. Litigation produces delays. Delays increase cost and risk, and higher risk disencourages investment or raises the prices for finished goods. That's the tact. And I'm going to say this. I'll give the devil his due on it. The left has done an absolutely phenomenal job of building out this network. The left has done an unbelievable job with using these tools, using their money, and using this kind of feedback loop to get their policy agenda passed, to get the outcomes that they want. I don't like what they've done. I don't agree with what they've done, but I can't sit here in good faith and tell you they have not been incredibly effective at doing so. They unequivocally have. There is no way that I could make the argument that this has been a wasted effort by those on the political left. And this part bolded for those watching the program live or after the fact about this feedback loop. lays out the disaster that this is. And there's again, sorry for those listening, but for those watching, this feedback, this graphic shows, Bloomberg and Soros and how they've got their tentacles in everything: conferences and events, climate groups, litigations, judges, regulations, universities, and so-called research that comes out of many of these institutions. They've done a very, very effective job at getting this stuff done. They've done a very effective job at taking what I can only describe as a very radical agenda, a very radical ideology, and turning it into reality. This is something that I would argue that everybody on the conservative right, hell, not even conservative right, anybody that would define themselves as a free market person, a free market capitalist, needs to be aware of. Because as we talk about the art of the delay, as this report is titled by the group called Power the Future, as we talk about this report, it has a real impact on your daily life. And that's what I want to focus on this morning. We'll come back to the report, but I want to focus on the impact because it's real. When these left-wing environmental groups get involved in either litigation or generating new research that becomes the gold standard as it relates to regulatory framework, when they bully these regulatory agencies into going through with their out-of-control left-wing climate agenda, it has an impact on your life. This is not just a bunch of research in universities. No, there are real-life implications, real-life impacts for this. Back earlier in 2025, the North Carolina General Assembly passed a piece of legislation, Senate Bill 266. It was called at the time, the Power Bill Reduction Act. And the point of this legislation and the way it was laid out is that it would eliminate the state's statutory goal to cut carbon emissions by 70% by 2030. That's not all that far along. 2030 is 4 years away. So this was a major change made by the North Carolina General Assembly. What was the justification for this legislation to eliminate some of those carbon goals within state government? Supporters of the legislation say that the policy change could save North Carolinians up to $15 billion in future utility costs. Let that sink in for a second. We're not talking about saving consumers a couple of bucks. We're talking about $15 billion. And it affects everybody, not just you as a home consumer. It affects your workplace. It affects places you go out to eat, places you go to shop. Utility bills are expensive. You look at the average utility bill across the United States is between $140 and $180 a month. So that's a pretty significant amount of money. And that's for your general home consumer. Look at a big box store. Look at a business that operates. Imagine what their utility bill is. Hundreds, thousands of dollars a month. Right? This stuff has a real life, real world implication and impact. And thankfully, due to this legislation being passed, thankful for the North Carolina General Assembly in doing this, these changes are starting to be rolled back here in North Carolina. The bill maintains that the long-term goal to reduce 100% of carbon emissions from 2005 levels by 2050. However, it removes the requirement that utilities hit an interim 2030 milestone, with utilities like Duke Energy, who is the largest electrical producer and provider in North Carolina, must still file long-range carbon plans with the North Carolina Utilities Commission, but the focus now shifts to longer-term goals of net zero emissions instead of this very close deadline coming up in 2030. And we're already seeing the impact of this. This legislation was passed back in the middle parts of 2025 by the General Assembly. It was vetoed by the governor, overridden by the General Assembly. And here's a headline from October the 1st of last year. Duke Energy ramps up nuclear, natural gas, extends coal, and emits wind in its latest energy plan. So in just the span of a couple of months here in North Carolina, you had this interim carbon goal by 2030 that was fortunately wiped away by the North Carolina General Assembly. And immediately we have seen the reaction here in North Carolina from a company that is the largest producer and provider of electricity across the state. So the idea that this is not impacting your day-to-day life is a fairy tale, because it absolutely is. The article over at carolinajournal.com reads as follows. Duke Energy relies more heavily on nuclear power, natural gas, and coal in its latest 2-year long-range energy modernization plan that was recently filed with the North Carolina Utilities Commission. The plan holds the line on solar power commitments, but calls for no use of wind power. Duke's new 2025 Carolinas Resource Plan projects an average of 2.1% annual increase in customer bills, lower than the rate of inflation, and significantly less than the projected costs for the previously approved plans, according to a news release from Duke Energy. So you talk about real-world implications and real-world impacts. There it is right there. Because with like this interim carbon goal that we're talking about here in North Carolina, with that being in effect, with that being in place, it forces the hand of Duke, forces the hand of other public utilities to adopt more expensive, less reliable forms of energy. Whether you are a fan of solar or wind energy or not, you cannot argue the fact that it is more expensive and it is inherently less reliable than things like natural gas, coal, and at the top of the food chain and all of this, nuclear energy. It just inherently is. I think solar and wind, I think it's cool technologically. I think the technology that allows that to happen is remarkable. And I think in certain aspects, depending on where you live, what the environment looks like, it might make sense for you to, for example, install something like solar on your house. I don't inherently hate solar or wind energy. What I hate is the fact that it is being rammed down the throats of U.S. consumers when it's not the best choice. And this goes to a larger discussion and a larger argument over government being involved in the free market. And that's exactly what you see with something like this report and something like you see with carbon goals and interim plan this and interim plan that. It's exactly what you see. You have got the government, whether we're talking about a federal or state government, putting their thumb on the scale, telling a utility like Duke or any other company that this is the kind of energy that you have to produce. Because the goal is we got to get net emissions to zero, or in this case, 70% by 2030. And the only way to do that is to not look at trusted, reliable, affordable forms of electricity. The only thing to look at is things like wind and solar. Nuclear seemingly is having a resurgence. I don't know that we're there yet as it relates to the broad appeal on it, but we're getting there. And actually, it's interestingly enough, a lot of the new work that's happening on the next generation of nuclear reactors is actually happening here in North Carolina. GE is producing these new SMRs. They're called small modular reactors. They're producing those in southeastern North Carolina. GE is making those reactors in the state of North Carolina, which if you really want to talk about saving the earth, if you really want to talk about protecting the environment, it would be an absolute no-brainer to go all in, full steam ahead, no pun intended, with these new generations of nuclear reactors. We're not talking about Chernobyl. We're not talking about 3 Mile Island. We're not talking about these energy facilities that were built in the 50s and 60s. These SMR facilities have a footprint that is no bigger than the size of a football field, an entire nuclear power plant that's the size of a literal football field. The technology is absolutely fascinating. The technology is, honestly, from a scientific standpoint, absolutely amazing. And so if your concern, if your issue, the thing that is causing you to lose sleep every night is the fact that the earth is going to light itself on fire due to climate change, then you should be all in on these new forms of nuclear energy. But many on the left are not. They believe that the solution is overpriced, unaffordable, unreliable platforms like wind and solar. If the sun is not shining, the solar panels are not at their full capacity. If the wind is not blowing, the turbines don't spin up to their full capacity. There is no ability to scale it up or scale it down. And we saw some of those impacts in North Carolina back a couple of Christmases ago. It's 2023, major blackouts throughout the state due to energy demand surges in and around the holidays. So don't tell me that this doesn't have an impact on your day-to-day life. Don't tell me that this isn't a very serious risk and concern going forward. It makes everything more expensive. From the things that you buy at the store to the ways that you heat and cool your home in the winter or in the summer. And these left-wing groups, again, to their credit, have done a masterful job at getting this agenda pushed forward. It's very, very dangerous. We'll dive into some additional details from this report. It's called The Art of the Delay, produced by a group called Power the Future. We'll get into additional details on that coming up here in just a couple of minutes, plus your comments as well as they roll in on our live platforms this morning. But before that, I want to tell you about the law group here in Wilmington and let you know that when legal challenges arise, make sure you put your trust in the law group. Since 2003, their experienced attorneys have provided high-quality, affordable legal services across Eastern North Carolina. Whether you're facing a divorce, navigating a real estate transaction, or maybe you're in a position where you need a strong criminal defense. If so, the law group has your back. Their dedicated team ensures your questions are answered and issues are resolved as quickly as possible. They're located in downtown Wilmington and just a phone call away at 910-251-6088, or you can visit them online at lawgroupnc.com. Give them a call, 910-251-6088, or visit their website, lawgroupnc.com. The Law Group, experience and dedication that you can rely on. We appreciate the Law Group, encourage you to reach out to them for any legal challenges, and again, cannot thank them enough for their continued support of the Nick Craig Show. All right, we'll grab a quick break. On the other side, we'll continue to talk about some of the dangers as it relates to environmental activism as the Nick Craig Show rolls along on a Wednesday morning, streaming live on YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7, wherever you get your podcasts. And welcome back to the Nick Craig Show. Thanks for spending some time with us here on this Wednesday morning, streaming live, YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook. The show is also available 24/7 in your favorite podcast app. Just search for the Nick Craig Show, and can now also be heard weeknights, 9 to 10 p.m. on WBT Radio in Charlotte. That is Charlotte's FM News Talk, 107.9 FM WBT. So we are continuing our coverage of this interesting report out from a group called Power the Future. The headline or the title of the report is The Art of the Delay, How Environmental Activism Raises Prices on Everyday Goods. And we talked about some of the impacts in North Carolina, some of the real things that have happened in this state over just the last 6 months or so that could and likely will help reduce the electrical costs here across the state as energy companies like Duke no longer have to shoehorn in these unreliable, expensive forms of energy, which include things like wind and solar. They're just being as blunt and honest as I can be about it. Wind and solar are way too expensive, and they're just too unreliable. Now, 20 years down the line, they may not be. But for right now, in early 2026, they still remain too expensive and too unreliable. So more from the report, it reads, from delayed to higher prices, and it kind of walks through more of what this process looks like. It says, when infrastructure projects are delayed, whether it's an energy pipeline, power transmission, ports, rail expansion, factories, or housing, the costs do not disappear. They are absorbed into the economy in predictable ways. Higher financial costs, and it notes projects under legal or regulatory uncertainty, which there's a lot of regulation as it relates to power infrastructure. Regulatory uncertainty carry capital for longer periods of time, increasing interest and financing expenses. Higher construction costs. Delays expose projects to inflation in labor and materials, often forcing redesigns or supplemental reviews. Reduced supply. When projects are slowed or canceled, the supply of energy, housing, and transportation capacity tightens. And finally, their last example, higher input costs across the economy. Energy, transportation, and logistics are embedded in nearly every consumer good. When those inputs become more expensive, prices rise broadly. It ends with saying this. Importantly, consumers do not need to live near a delayed pipeline or power line to feel the effects. In a national market, localized supply constraints raise prices everywhere. It also notes that even under cautious assumptions, the impact is real. Energy, transportation, and commercial space accounts for roughly 25% of the cost for most consumer goods. So it's felt in every single impact, every single facet of the economy. When you have these left-wing groups that eat, breathe, and sleep environmental activism, they delay the implementation of projects going from coal to natural gas, which is something that we've seen a lot of because natural gas is a lot more efficient than burning coal. So you've seen a lot of power plants, even here across the state of North Carolina, go from what were originally coal-fired burning power plants to burning natural gas. It's a lot more efficient. It makes a lot more sense. When those projects are delayed, and in some cases, folks, we're not talking about the delay of just a couple of months. You could be talking about delays that go on for years. And so you've got an energy company like Duke that, let's say, wants to make a change, wants to transition a plan or bring a new facility online, and it gets bogged down by these left-wing activist groups in court. It gets bogged down by these utilities commissions or these other state or federal agencies that are responsible for the permitting or the approval or the final check because they've got left-wing activists that they've installed in these places. When that stuff goes on, it can take years. And so you've got a company like Duke that has to roll those costs along as it takes. And also, at the meantime, and I don't think this report mentions it, litigation, in case you weren't aware, tends to be rather expensive. Litigation is not cheap. When you've got to have high-powered attorneys in courtrooms for 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years fighting to get a project approved, not only have you delayed many of those costs that have to continue to roll on, you're spending potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, on the actual litigation itself. And Duke Energy is not absorbing or eating those costs, as this report notes. What do? They pass it on to the consumer. They pass it on to you and I. You see it in your yearly rate increases as it relates to your power bill. You're paying those things each and every month. It doesn't just stop. It doesn't just go away. And so there's a lot of additional coverage in this report. You can get access to it. I'll put it in the show notes over at patreon.com/Nick Craig. I'd encourage you to read through this. It's not very long. It's only 4 pages, and it gives some examples of what these impacts look like. It gives some real world examples on things that you buy, like consumer electronics, where you're just coming off the holiday shopping season, fashion toys, remote controlled cars, and things like toy drones, things like Legos, what the impact is on these products, which all of them individually in themselves, the financial impact is small, like per Lego set, for example, in their report. They talk about how some of the impacts could be as high as 1.5% to 2%. You might think, 2%, who cares? But imagine how many Lego sets are sold in and around the holiday season. Hundreds of thousands, millions. I don't even know what the answer is. Tack 2% onto every single one of those products sold. You're not just talking about a couple of bucks. You're talking about millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's just one example highlighted in this report. Environmental activism is a real threat and a real danger to everybody. As a free market person, as a free market capitalist, and as a consumer that wants to pay as little as possible for these things, I don't want public utility companies or private utility companies, any utility company, to be forced into, be bullied into implementing unreliable, more expensive forms of energy. Electrical generation, folks, is not something that is new. We didn't just wake up yesterday and discover electricity and figure out how it works. It's a pretty understood entity at this point. It is a pretty well understood business. Major utility companies, I keep going back to Duke because that's who most people have here across North Carolina. Duke understands how to generate electricity. They understand the business. They understand the model. They understand how to profit handsomely for it. We understand all of this. It's not brand new science that has just popped up in the last couple of months or weeks or even years. It's well understood at this point. But you've got these regulatory agencies, and at the federal level, under the previous administration, what did you see? You saw them pushing things like offshore wind, which was a major discussion up and down the eastern seaboard. Pushing these very expensive, very unreliable, and by the way, very environmentally damaging projects, including offshore wind. Some actually off the North Carolina coast that fortunately have been stopped by the Trump administration off the Brunswick County coast. And the environmental impact was real. You probably remember seeing the photos on social media a couple of years ago of all of these whales washing on shore on the Jersey and Virginia coast. Dozens of them. Why? Because the individuals building these offshore wind projects were using sonar mapping to map the ocean floor. It was disorienting the whales, and they were getting hit by boats and getting killed. This is, again, all coming from the environmental left, which is the most ironic thing in all of it. The individuals that claim to care so much about the environment, the individuals that make it their life's mission to stop climate change and be bleeding heart liberals, these individuals are the ones that are pushing for this stuff that's literally leading to the extinction of the whale population in portions of the Atlantic Ocean. That's not environmentally friendly. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. But that's what they're pushing. Because it's all about the ideology. It's all about the agenda. It's not what makes sense. It's not what's logical. It's not what's already very well understood within the energy generation market. It's completely and totally ideologically driven. And I will contend to you that ideologically driven solutions like this for electrical generation or energy is an awful, terrible, dangerous thing. Very, very dangerous. And when you really boil it down to what we're talking about here, at the end of the day, we're talking about making these decisions to stop, quote unquote, climate change. We're talking about making these incredibly detrimental decisions so that we can save the earth, protect Mother Nature. Meanwhile, you won't find any evidence to back up the fact that doing these things, forcing electric vehicles on the U.S. consumer, forcing offshore wind, forcing solar power on the U.S. consumer, none of this stuff, there's no evidence that exists to back up that this solves a problem, that this creates a better earth. I mean, over the last couple of years, you've seen, especially in the car market, I saw a story yesterday. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick. It was from, I think it was from CNBC about, let me see if I can find this. It was a CNBC story about Ford, the obviously the very large car maker. And the report from Ford showed that they have had their highest vehicle sales since 2019, seeing major upticks. Ford Motor Company announced on Tuesday that its U.S. vehicle sales last year increased 6%, marking the company's best annual sales since 2019. And all the way buried in the story here in this article over at CNBC is this. Like many automakers, Ford's all-electric vehicle business notably declined by 14% last year, including a roughly 52% plummet during the fourth quarter. A nearly 22% increase in sales of Ford's hybrid vehicles, which the company expects to grow, asserting it's offsetting those losses. Traditional vehicles with internal combustion engines continued to dominate Ford sales, representing about 86% of the company's volume in 2025. As they are, like many others, have decided to walk away from the EV market. Now, I'll say this about EVs. For those that have followed me for any significant period of time, you know that I think EVs are cool. The technology is fascinating. The fact that you can drive a car with a battery in it is really cool. But I am a strong believer that that is your decision to make as a consumer. If an EV works for you and the demands that you have and the needs that you have, I think you should go out and buy one. What I don't think should happen is in states like California, where in the coming years, they are essentially going to outlaw the sale of internal combustion engines, aka your regular car that you put gasoline in. They're going to outlaw that. They are determining what the consumer wants. The government does not know, whether we're talking about a state, federal, local government, the government does not know what is best for the people. The people know what's best for the people. I know, radical idea. Crazy concept. The people know what's best. That's how free market capitalism works. That's why America continues to be the most profitable, successful nation anywhere across the earth, because the consumers get to decide what they want, what they don't want. So when you've got the federal government or state governments heavily subsidizing EVs, many of those spigots have been turned off. I think it was one of the reasons that Trump and Elon Musk had their breakup earlier this year, which, by the way, Elon had dinner with Trump and Melania back over the last couple of days. So it seems like that relationship is healing. From all accounts, Elon is going to get heavily involved in the 2026 midterm elections, which is phenomenal news for Republicans across the nation. Very, very good information. Very good news to hear on that. Part of their breakup may have been the fact that Trump was hacking and slashing some of these EV policies, some of these EV decisions from the federal government. I don't want the federal government subsidizing a car. Just like energy, cars are not new technology. They didn't just show up yesterday. They've existed now for hundreds of years, or over 100 years, I should say. We know how they work. businesses like Ford and GM and Toyota, everybody else, they know what the business is, they know how it works, and they will produce the vehicles that people want to buy. And so as you saw a huge increase in EV sales over the last couple of years, followed by what can only be described as a very sharp decline like we're seeing right now, that's because the spigot got turned off. The free money is going away. The federal government is no longer giving you potentially tens of thousands of dollars worth of subsidies to purchase said vehicles. I think EVs are cool. Comment coming in on our Rumble live chat this morning. I want a self-driving Tesla. Yeah, I think the technology is unbelievably fascinating. Now, for me, I would not purchase an EV. Not because I think that they're stupid or they just doesn't work for the kind of environment that I'm in. I drive a lot. I don't want to be in a situation where I need to pause for 60 or 90 minutes to charge my vehicle. It's not practical for me right now. Maybe in the future it will be. But right now it's not. If I was purchasing a new car today, I would only be looking at either regular internal combustion engines or some sort of hybrid. I would not be looking at an EV. Just isn't practical for me. Might be practical for you. I know a bunch of people that have EVs. They love them. They think that they are, for them, it works for their driving style. That's phenomenal. I'm glad they have that opportunity. That's how the free market system works. But they shouldn't be buying one because the federal government says, we'll give you $11,000 if you go and buy this car. That's what was happening under the previous administration. It was propping up companies like Tesla. It was forcing these major traditional manufacturers like Ford, like GM, to get into this EV market where most of these companies, frankly, have completely lost their ass. If you look at the EV market, and it's not been that long that the companies have decided to start introducing this technology. If you look at the amount of infrastructure that they invested, all of the time, the money and the effort that they invested into this EV market, again, because there was just a crap load of free, quote unquote, free federal money, they've all lost their ass on it. They're all going away from EVs because now that the spigot is turned off, now that the free federal money is gone, the regular consumer goes, yeah, it's really not that lucrative anymore. It's an expensive vehicle and it's an EV. You're no longer giving me $11,000 worth of brakes to buy the car, which is exactly what was happening. So companies like Ford have decided, because based on consumer demand, that internal combustion and hybrid is the way to go. 86% of the company's volume in 2025 of Ford's was traditional internal combustion engines. The rest of it was hybrids, and then a little sliver of it was EVs, as all of these major car manufacturers are moving away from it. Why? Because the market's not there yet. It will be. I promise you this. EVs will become the norm. I don't know when. Could be 5 years, could be 10 years, could be 20 years. The technology is getting better and better day by day. The battery capacity continues to improve for these cars. The practicality is continuing to improve. The charging network continues to be built out in a relatively short amount of time, in the grand scheme of time. EVs will become, very well likely, could become the dominant car. But we're not there yet. And that's fine. But let's not sit here and pretend that we are. I remember vividly, I couldn't tell you what the headline of the story was. I couldn't even tell you where I could find it. I remember covering this story on the radio. This is probably 2+ years ago. The Biden administration set aside, hundreds of millions of dollars or even billions of dollars for this charging network that they were going to implement. The federal government being in the business of building EV chargers. They had spent some ungodly amount of money. It's like tens of millions of dollars. And they had brought two different charging stations online. Not 2 parks of charging stations, 2 individual chargers online. They had spent something like $10 or $15 million. It was a complete disaster because, surprise, surprise, the federal government is not in the business of building electric vehicle chargers. I know, it's going to be shocking news for you to hear. Breaking news here for you this morning on the Nick Craig Show. The federal government doesn't know how to build EV chargers effectively. Tesla does. Other companies do. They're doing it right now. They've been doing it now for quite some time. So all of this to be said, kind of rolling back to bringing us back to the conversation this morning. Energy or environmental activism is very dangerous. It sets up the United States, I would argue, for a national security issue. Without safe and reliable electricity, I think it puts the United States at a serious risk from adversaries across the world. I don't want that. From a cost perspective, it continues to cause the middle class and lower class Americans to struggle month in and month out because of these rising electrical demands. And number three, it is the worst example of government intervention. And it is completely abject to the free market capitalist system that we have here in America. If people want to install solar panels on their home, if it's cost affordable to do so, then they should. I'll admit, back a couple of years ago, I did some research into getting solar installed on my house. As I was doing the research, as I was doing the math, it didn't make sense for me. My roof's not big enough. I don't get enough sunlight. There's some high trees. Didn't make sense to invest $10,000 or $15,000 into solar. The time that it would have taken to pay it off just didn't make practical sense. So I didn't invest in it. I didn't make the investment. But when you've got the government saying, "Hi, we'll cover the cost. We'll pay for this," you're still paying for it. It's just not directly coming out of your bank account. I don't want the government involved in that stuff. I'm not a fan of subsidies. I'm not a fan of these systems where the government puts their thumb on the scale of what the consumer actually wants and what the consumer actually needs. This is a pretty eye-opening report, again, produced by a group called Power the Future. I'll throw a link to it over at our Patreon channel for those that are interested in getting access to daily show notes and more. You can head on over to patreon.com/Nick Craig. That's patreon.com/Nick Craig, or visit the website nickcraig.com. You'll see a support and Patreon tab listed right there on the website, patreon.com/Nick Craig. Once again, thanks to the law group here in Wilmington for their continued support, Melissa Gott and their team. Visit them online, lawgroupnc.com, or give them a call at 910-251-6088. That's going to do it for a Wednesday edition of the Nick Craig Show, streaming live 7 a.m. weekday mornings on YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, available 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts, and now heard nightly on WBT Radio in Charlotte, 9 to 10. We'll do it again tomorrow morning right here on the Nick Craig Show.